recording? There we go. So we left off, like we said, with just kind of really using our crease brush, our draw sharp brush. We even saw our blob, right? These are some neat ones. Remember, unified strength you can turn off. That way, you notice how my crease has got a strength of like 0.228, but my smooth doesn't, right? It's different. I like to have my smooth be lower, right? And that first of the kind of the orange brushes is your smooth. There is actually a flatten one. If you ever want to use flatten, right? You can just go here, and what flatten does is you can kind of see it just kind of pushes in and kind of tries to flatten out an area. All right. So there we go. Flattens there if you need it, if you want it. So you can kind of flatten that shape out a bit there. This does tend to be a little more useful for hard surface sculpting, but even in this area stuff, it can be used. So this is kind of one of those features where, hey, it's available. If you want to use it, use it. You might find sometimes you like it on organic stuff. But that very first orange one is your smooth. And with unified strength off, you can have a different strength. So like see how the draw is higher and the draw sharp is even higher than that. It just makes it so that you can have a very subtle smooth, right? If it's too high, it'll smooth it out too quick, right? So if I got smooth on, you see how it's kind of already smoothing that a lot? What is going on with the undo? Come on. What is going on there? All right, let me not save that and reopen it. Go. I don't know why smooth wasn't undoing. That was a bit weird. All right. So anyways, though, you have that control, right? And if this was higher, you'd see it smooth it even quicker. So I always like to have a very subtle smooth strength. That way, like when I smooth, it's not overdoing it, right? I can kind of soften just enough, right? If it's too high, see how it just gets rid of it super quick? So I always like to have my smooth pretty low so that I can just kind of soften a little bit. And that's what smooth really does, right? Now remember, though, every brush in Blender, shift will smooth, right? So I've gone back to my crease. So if I want to do a little more creasing here, right, I can kind of do a little bit of creasing there. I can hold down shift, and that automatically goes to smooth. And you can kind of see how I can soften that a little bit. So you'll often want to take advantage of smoothing because you don't want it to be an all-powerful crease, right? Oftentimes, as a shape goes, it'll transition to another area and it kind of fades out. And that's what your smooth really allows you to do, is kind of fade that effect out. And that's why it's important to be aware of that stuff, right? Remember, shift is always smooth. So rarely, unless I'm planning on doing a ton of smoothing, will I actually turn the smooth brush on. I'll just hold down shift from whatever other brush I'm in to smooth a little bit, then go do some more creasing, smooth a little bit, then go do some creasing. Now, one of the other things I want to start to show you guys today, and that was just some reinforcement of what we've done before, was how to attach or use images for sculpting, right? Up to this point, I've really just been using stock brushes and not really adjusting their settings that much to do some cool effects. And we see there's some great core brushes that can allow you to do some neat stuff, right? And just focusing on things like shift or control to inverse. Those are very good, very useful to be using and know about. So I'm going to go back to my draw, right? My regular draw brush right up here. It's the very first blue one. And what I want to do is I want to show you guys how to use images for this. Now, because the images are going to have finer details in them, you're often going to need to have more geometry, right? Now, this is one of those things, if your computer just can't handle it, your device can't handle it, which that's going to be the case for some of you, not all of you, this will be adequate, right? Just using things like your draw sharp, crease, blob to kind of do some cool forms like this. That would work well, right? But if you really want to add extra details and use images to add extra details, I want to make sure you guys know how to do that. So remember the blue wrench, right? The white screwdriver, white wrench, that's kind of your properties for your brushes, really any tool. Blue wrench right down here is, remember, your modifier. And we have a multi-resolution modifier on, right? That's what's giving us this ability to sculpt and go up and down the levels, right? Remember, page down goes down, page up goes up. But right now, when we go up, it stops at level 3, because that's the level we've gone to. So if you want to go past, if you want to go higher than level 3, which gives us about 300,000 faces, right? And remember, that's right here. Just go to the little kind of pull down right there for the 2 circles overlapping. And you can just turn on statistics, and that'll show you your polygon count stuff. I can hit subdivide, and you'll see what that'll do is this will take us to level 4 for those. And now you see there's 1 million, right? 1,300,000. Now, I think I'm going to leave it at that just to be on the safe side. But you could even go up higher to 5. I can easily get it up to higher levels. In fact, I can hit subdivide again. Yes. So basically, now I've subdivided to level 5. And now you see I'm at 5 million polygons, right? So that gives us a much higher level, right, of polygons to work with. This is going to allow us to do much finer details. Even with crease, I could go in here and I can now really get in here and do some really fine creases, right? I couldn't do this kind of creasing at that earlier level. So you want to start to do finer wrinkles in certain areas, right? And even without an image, crease can do it with more polygons. So to get fine details, you really simply put just need more geometry, right? And that's where you use your multi-resolution, you subdivide some more. Hold down shift to do a little smoothing to kind of fade those and transition them a little better. Usually at the ends, you kind of fade that a little bit. And so even our crease brush can benefit from more polygons, right? It's going to allow us to just get much kind of nicer, more subtle wrinkling in here. There we go. All right, so just remember, subdividing, quite important, right? Go as far as your computer, your device will let you, right? Blender should be able to do at least a couple of levels, get you up to a couple 100,000 on just about anything. Outside of that, you might run into some more issues. I feel like you should all be able to get to 1 million on whatever device you're on, but getting up to 5, 10 million might be a little trickier. Do what you can, though, right? Okay. So now I do want to go back to that draw, and I want to talk to you guys about how to do images for this, right? Now this really does become needing a bunch of textures, so you'll have to maybe, if you want to use some textures, you might have to find some, right? But remember, you can always go to the little kind of red checkerboard down here, right? This little red checkerboard. And once you're in this little red checkerboard, you can go to New. So remember the little red checkerboard at the very bottom of the properties menus for textures. You click on New, and now I can open, right? So now this will allow me to browse for where I might have some textures that I could use. Now this does become a question of, do I have some good textures here? I think I do have some stuff in the stencils that I've got from other classes. Let's see here. So we're going to find something that'll be pretty interesting. If you need to see them, right, so when you click on the open to open this browser up, you can actually switch to different display modes, right? So you can actually kind of see the thumbnail version of it. And if these images kind of can show up in here, like the decal one, you can kind of see them show up a little more in here. It's just a question of which ones will show up as thumbnails. Come on. Taking a little long to load. There we go. It's just kind of taking a bit of time to kind of load these up. There we go. So remember, you can actually, in this browser, switch from list to thumbnail mode, and that will allow you to see these images more. And at that point, you could kind of try using some kind of texture. In this case, I'm probably just going to use something that's got a bit of noise in it, like this. This always comes back to your source texture. right? Textures.com is a great place to start, right? You will have to create a free account. There's a paid account. Guys, don't do the paid account, do the free account. The limitations to the free account at textures.com is something like 15 tokens a day, and basically textures cost a token or two. But that'll at least usually get you like 10, 15 textures. Also, the free account only gives you access to the lower resolution textures. However, those are still like 1,000 plus pixels big, so they're still good resolution textures. Take advantage of going to textures.com, creating a free account, start to find and download some textures. Of course, you can do Google search for textures, but textures.com is safe because those are all royalty free. You can use them both for education and commercial use and stuff. In this case, I'm just going to kind of take advantage of just some of the stuff I've got there. But this is where if you want to use textures, if you want to use images to sculpt with, you have to have images to sculpt with. So you're going to have to go find some, right? So I'm just going to use this one because it'll work well enough for us. Open image. That is now loaded in there, right? We now have this texture available to us. So there's two ways I could use this texture. One, we can go up to the texture menu up here, and you see it's available already right there. So see how it's kind of available? I can click it. Now, if I just set this to mapping viewplane, right, you will notice that this texture will now just sculpt based on the brush, right? So it'll just repeat this pattern. That's our stamp function, right? So basically, it just kind of keeps taking this image and stamp, 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 right? If I was to actually change my stroke from space to, say, anchored, right, I could do this. Remember, anchored lets you kind of drag it out. And if I go up or down, it rotates it. If I drag it left or right, it makes it bigger or smaller. And basically what it does when you have regular space stroke and viewplane on is the stamp is doing this, except it's doing them right on top of each other, right? So when you have just regular viewplane on with space stroke, it's doing this, stamp, 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 stamp. So it's kind of just applying it again and again and again. But this is one of the neat things about this. You notice how you can use these features for this? So you can actually use your different strokes, right? And of course, you can use your different sculpt amounts. Come on, there we go. Make sure to pick that texture again. Sometimes you might have to reload. If you undo too far, sometimes it makes you go back. It's a little bit annoying. Let's see here. Where was our stencils? I also have some textures in here I could possibly use also, but I'll go back up. So I was kind of liking the one I had. Stencils. Add that. Make sure it's in there. Make sure you pick it here so it's active. There we go. And you'll see it. It'll show up in there. Remember, space, though, is the default one. And viewplane works really well for stamps. In this case, I can maybe just turn the strength up a little bit more, and you'll be able to see it better as we go. But it's just taking that image and it's dropping it, dropping it, dropping it, dropping it. And you see how you can already take advantage of this to sculpt in these kinds of things, right? So remember, you have this ability to easily start to use images to sculpt in kind of scaling where you want to, right? Or noise. So remember, viewplane will give you this. Stencil will give you this. You can switch strokes, right? Space is usually good to work with viewplane. But you can also go in here and you can use line, right? So if I switch to line, you'll see how it'll do a line of those. So line will work with this also. And we saw that anchored can be a great way to just kind of drop it down at different sizes. So see, if I want this more pronounced in some areas, I could kind of drop it in here a little bit. So remember, anchored gives you a very distinctly different kind of method for this, right? What it does is when you click, it just starts to draw out kind of a shape, right? You drag left or right, it makes it big or small. You drag up or down, it rotates it. And this could be a great way to kind of make it smaller in certain areas, right? Make it larger in other ones. So you see how you could just by loading an image in, going to the red checkerboard down here, adding a new texture, opening it, finding the texture you want. If you just have viewplane on, and then switch around your strokes, you can get a lot of different variety right there for texturing. Now, of course, I can go to space, and I could, because that's what your strokes are controlling. Texture controls those texture things. So viewplane is kind of really useful. Tiled will kind of allow you to repeat it, but it's kind of just like a stencil that you have a little less control over. At the very bottom of the mapping type, right? So when you go to texture, there's mapping. That's viewplane. Stencil is at the very bottom of it. And when you turn stencil on, you'll see it right here, right? And what you need to be aware of is that right mouse button moves it. Control right mouse button rotates it. Shift right mouse button scales it. Now, you will notice that your Alt zoom doesn't work because of the right mouse button for moving this. So that's where you'll use scroll wheel to zoom, unless you decide to set up different quick keys for this. But you'll notice that Stencil works for this. And Stencil, remember, lets you see the image. You can move the image by right mouse button. Control right mouse button, particularly if you're at a corner, will rotate it easily for you. And shift right mouse button will scale it up. And you'll see that you can actually sculpt with stencils also. So if you have a very specific effect in stencils that you want to paint, you could take advantage of that, right? So remember, right mouse button moves it, control right mouse button rotates it, shift right mouse button scales it, right? Your Alt right mouse button zoom won't work when stencil's on because of that, so scroll wheel will kind of zoom you. But you'll notice stencil in itself behaves a little bit differently to the viewplane, right? Because whereas viewplane is either, it's really just kind of letting you just continually paint it, right? It paints. Basically, it does this, but it keeps doing it. Like it drops it, but like basically almost on top of each other so that it just kind of creates a great noise pattern. Stencil, you see the image, and you're painting exactly the part of the image that you want, right? So for like a general noise like this, Stencil's not going to really be any better than Stamp would be, right? But when you have very specific patterns like brick, Stamp, the viewplane feature is going to be bad for this. It's not going to be good, right? So if it's a really noisy texture, you're really not going to notice much difference generally between a stencil and kind of the viewplane feature, right? Between stencil and viewplane. When you get something that's a little bit more decidedly unique, it has distinct differences in areas, or it's more regular, less noisy, stencil will be vastly superior to the viewplane option. But you notice how the strokes work for all this stuff as well. So remember, these are some of the cool features that you could take advantage of to add some of this extra stuff if you want to. Remember, right mouse button, move the stencil, control right mouse button to rotate it, shift right mouse button to scale it. You will lose your Alt right mouse button for zoom though for this. My personal Blender at home, I actually changed it to the quick key for it to S. For stencil like Mudbox, and that way I have my normal zoom functionality. That is something you can change, of course, in edit preferences, key map, and then I think it's in 3D view. Let's see here. Let's see, image paint, global, and you see how you can start to go in here and actually see how here's your stencil brush controls. You see it's right, shift right, control right. So kind of one of those things where if you want, you can change these around, right? You can kind of open this up, and you can change this to a different key, right? So keep in mind that you can actually change this to mouse buttons or, even kind of just set it to specific shortcuts, right? And see right here, you can switch from mouse to keyboard, right? And you'll see that that will allow you to type in an actual key. So keep in mind, right, that that's kind of one of those neat things you can do. Restore to the defaults. There we go. But you can actually do that. If you want to change your stencil quick keys, you can actually do that in Blender. You guys will probably just stick with the normal ones, right? Scroll wheel for zoom when you're sculpting and painting is not that big a deal. But just a little bit about that. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my texture back to viewplane instead of stencil. And then you see the normal rotates available. And you'll notice that this still generally works pretty well, right? It's not radically changing a little bit there. So keep in mind that you could do some neat stuff like this, right? And you can even go to texture and you can actually change the sizes of how much it's going to paint in there. So if you want the noise to be a bit bigger, you could turn size to like maybe 0.3, 0.3, 0.3. And then you see how the texture size is bigger. So believe it or not, if you actually take the texture size right here and turn it down below 1, you'll notice that the texture actually gets bigger. So Blender actually lets you control how big this is going to paint without changing the brush size. So you can actually tell your texture to be smaller or larger, in this case, for your brushes. But kind of a neat functionality. I wanted to make sure you guys really kind of get to appreciate and see viewplane, stencil, all that good stuff. All right, so I'm going to save that. And I wanted to start to explore a little bit of, and we'll probably do a little more texturing and some baking on Thursday. But I wanted to start to get you guys to see that you have these different strokes, that you can actually load textures in, and that there is a really distinct difference between viewplane and stencils. Things we've seen on our texturing as well. But this all applies to sculpting also. So all of that functionality that you were using for texturing actually works with sculpting also. All your strokes work with sculpting. Viewplane and stencil work with that. They basically have the same behaviors, right? It's just that they actually pull the surface out, right? You can actually see that's polygons bumping off the surface. And that's why we needed to subdivide this to get it to higher levels, right? If I go to page down, and then page down to level 3, you see how that level 3 just can't support that detail that well, right? Level 3 just can't. So to really start to get that kind of detail and have it look pretty nice, you're going to have to get to, 5 million at least. So the bigger stuff, like the blobs, the wrinkles, the creases, you could do that at a lower level, but if you're really trying to get really small creases, if you're really trying to get a lot better detailed noise texture like this for scales, you need more geometry. All right, so I'm going to go to 4 for object mode, right? Go. And I'm going to select quad gear for now. Turn the eyeball fallout on, and I'm going to turn the quad body off for the moment. And this, of course, also needs a multi-resolution. So in the blue wrench, I go to Add Modifier. We go to Multi-Resolution. And we subdivide. And we're going to get this up to, let's say maybe about a million. Like I said, once again, kind of see what you could do with your machine, right? It's going to depend. So about 2 million for mine should be pretty good there. I'll hit 5 for sculpt. Remember to turn symmetry on up here, right? Now we get this symmetry sculpting. All right, so that's up there. And remember, one of the things you could do is you could mask, right? In this case, I've kind of already got that nice little kind of ridging there. But if I wanted some smaller ridging, I could always go to my mask brush here. Remember, it's way down here. It's kind of looks like kind of like a brush and a ball, and it's kind of white. That's mask. I'm going to make my brush size smaller by using the bracket keys. I'm going to turn the strength for this mask up to 1. And what I could do is I could actually paint a little bit of mask in here. Now, of course, if I wanted to, I could change my stroke to stabilize stroke. So You'll see how the stroke will be a little cleaner. I could also, if I wanted to, change this to line. So if I just kind of wanted a nice little line, in fact, I think I'll do a smaller line here. So see how I can do a line? And we can make these little neat line masks in some areas if we wanted to. Or inversely, we could do this, right? So you see how mask can be cool because we kind of paint this on without changing the surface yet. And you see how your line is an awesome stroke. A lot of you guys, if some of you guys remember from Mudbox, we didn't have the line feature. We don't. Also, if you're ever to go into ZBrush, they technically have it, but it is so clumsy that Blender just blows it out of the water. ZBrush's line functionality within the lazy mouse is clumsy. I'm like, ugh. Blender just makes it so much easier. But remember, we've got this nice little line function here that we can use. There's some really, really neat masking tools Blender has. We're not going to be able to go through all of them, but there's some cool ones. So remember, masking, and you see all these strokes work with masks as well. Even the texturing and stencils and viewplane stuff works with masks. So these pretty much will work with just about all of your sculpting tools, right? So I'm just kind of doing some lines here. There we go. Kind of get a little bit more up here as well. And there we go. So you can use your line with masks. You can then invert your mask, right? You'll notice that there is up here a masking menu. And some of you guys remember seeing this from our crab, right? Remember our crab creature we did at the beginning? You can inverse your mask, right? Invert your mask, Control I. Because whatever you paint, that kind of darkish gray, that won't be affected, right? When you're painting the mask, it's the area that won't be affected. In this case, I want to affect those lines. It's just a lot easier to paint the line as a mask and then invert it. So anything that's not that dark gray, you can affect. So I could go to draw here, and I can just use my draw brush, if I get the strength INF up, to pull those out. But this is kind of a slow, clumsy way to do it, right? So one of the things I could do, and if you ever need to turn your texture off, just click on the X to turn it off. It's actually still there, it's just not currently active. But you notice how that's kind of a slow, clumsy way to do this. Remember, Blender, way down here, has what's called mesh filter. It's kind of this like a sphere with kind of this blue kind of blob trying to escape a box. Mesh filter. And what that does is it goes up here and you see how you've got a bunch of options. Inflate, relax, sharpen, enhance details. Inflate I love though, so we'll have inflate on. And what's really cool is if we switch to this mesh filter with inflate, I could left click drag and you see how it inflates them all the same amount. And if you drag in, it goes in. If you drag out, they go out. So you've got this really great inflate mesh filter, right? That allows you to do some really, really cool, neat stuff there. And then, of course, we can go back to mask, clear mask, Control A to get rid of it. And if I want, I could go back up to my draw, and I could go to stroke, drag dot, right? Go back to texture here, or not texture, but brush. And if I want more of a rivet or a button, I could turn the hardness up for even the regular draw brush. So you notice how in the brush menu there's a feature called hardness, and there's some cool other features here. I'm really not going to be able to show them all to you guys this project, but there's some cool stuff in there. You can do some masking based on face sets, mesh boundaries, which is kind of cool. But hardness with drag dot will allow me to do this. So I can just left click drag and it's going to drag this dot. Rivets or buttons, whatever you want it to be. So you notice how drag dot has this really cool distinct behavior. And if I turn the hardness back to 0, see how it's much more of a softer kind of subtle button versus this harder one. So even just your regular draw brush without a texture, if you just go to brush, turn up the hardness, and switch to a different stroke like drag dot, it allows you to drag dots out. Now, of course, you can even attach a texture to this if you wanted to, right? But oftentimes, if you're just looking to do simple rivets, you don't need to. All right. That'll be a great place to stop. We'll do a little bit of image texturing and probably explore these a little bit more on Thursday. But that's good. We'll stop there.